Dead America, the Second Month, Atticus on the Rails, Part 6. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 46. Rebuild Day 16. Madison sat by the front window of the small house just outside of downtown. A couple of hours had passed since they arrived, fleeing the heavily armed ex-soldiers that had been pursuing them. Much to Madison's surprise, they hadn't attempted an assault while the sun was still behind the horizon. It wasn't difficult to figure out why, however, as the rising sun illuminated the throng of ghouls surrounding the house. Madison let out a sigh, looking above their heads to catch a slight glimpse of the beautiful colors of the sky. Reds and purples bounced off of the clouds, and she drank in the sight, almost able to pretend for a moment that she was in another place, another time. Her fantasy shattered when decrepit fingernails scratched against the window, the scree sound sending a shiver up her spine. "Well, it was nice while it lasted," she murmured as she turned her attention back to the hundreds of zombies just outside of the house. A small fit of coughing echoed from the kitchen, and she sighed, heading in to check on Atticus, who was still feeling the effects of being trapped inside of a burning house. "You gonna make it there, cowboy?" she asked, finding her voice a lot gentler than it maybe once would have been at a time like this. Atticus nodded. "Yeah, it's starting to clear up," he rasped, voice still sounding a bit like sandpaper. "There's more water in the pantry if you need it," she said, inclining her head towards the small pantry door. "If I drink any more, I'm going to be swimming out of here," he admitted, patting his belly. She shook her head. "Kind of sad that our options are so bad at the moment, that creating a flood is currently our best chance we have at escaping," she said dryly, though her mind couldn't help but conjure up a delightful image of using a fire hose to get rid of all the zombies. "Still a nightmare out there?" Atticus asked, turning towards her. She nodded. "Those things are 10, 15 deep," she said, motioning with her hands. "On the plus side, none of those killers have tried to make a push on us." "If they were smart, they'd just stick some snipers up in the second story of the houses back there and wait for us to try and break out," Atticus said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. Madison cocked a brow. "Okay. Whatever plan we come up with involves going out the back door," she declared, crossing her arms. He chuckled. "Sorry, didn't mean to blow a hole in your plan there," he said, offering her an apologetic smile. "Well, I haven't come up with anything yet," she trailed off, but an idea suddenly swarmed in her head. "However, I think you might have just given me one." She held up a hand. "Uh-oh," he said with a sigh, leaning back against the counter. "I recognize that tone in your voice." "You haven't known me long enough to know my voice that well," she argued, pointing a finger at him. He raised his palms. "Very true," he admitted, "but I recognize that general tone. Something's about to get royally messed up." She smirked. "Well, you're not wrong," she said, confirming his fears. "At least, I hope you're not wrong. I gotta go check the garage. Can you hold down the fort?" He nodded, motioning for her to go do her thing. "Have at it," he said. Madison headed out to the garage, which was dark and musty. She pulled out a flashlight and shone it around, finding a variety of tools on the wall, which wasn't what she was looking for. There were no vehicles either, just empty space all the way to the far wall, which was filled with a ton of yard supplies. "Now we're cooking," she said, and scanned the goods as she approached, finding a few canisters of fuel sitting in the corner. She nodded and grinned to herself before turning on her heel and heading back to the kitchen. "You got something?" Atticus asked as she approached. "How do you feel about explosions?" she asked, putting her hands on her hips. He hesitated, crossing his arms. Depends on where they are," he said slowly. "Love 'em in movies. Not so much when I'm close enough to feel the heat coming off of them." But you're not opposed, right? She asked, leaning forward a bit. He sighed in resignation. You want to blow something up? He asked. Madison nodded. We're not distracting our way out of this situation, so we need something strong, she explained. Found some stuff in the garage that I should be able to make into something that causes quite the boom. And then what? He asked. Hopefully, it's big enough to clear us a path out of here, she replied with a shrug. Get to another house, hotwire as a vehicle, and we're out of this town. He nodded thoughtfully. What about the soldiers? He asked. With any luck, they'll have written us off by now, she replied. But if they're still after us, then we deal with them. All I know is if we don't get out of here, our only consolation prize will be not being killed by their bullets. Okay, explosion it is, Atticus agreed, pushing off of the counter. What do you need? Maybe an hour of time, she replied. If you can just keep watch out here. He nodded firmly. I can manage, he said. Okay, if I need anything else, I'll give you a shout, she said, giving him a thumbs up as she headed back to the garage to build something that would hopefully clear them a path, or at the very least, take a lot of monsters out with them. Chapter 2. Atticus stood guard by the front window, making sure to stay off to the side in case he was right about a sniper being out there. The zombies in the front continued to mass, but the rate of growth had slowed down as of late. Finally, Madison emerged from the garage, carrying a mid-sized drink cooler that had a makeshift fuse coming from a drilled-out hole near the bottom. There was a mountain of duct tape holding it together, and she slammed it so hard on the table that Atticus jumped. Relax, cowboy, she drawled. It isn't going to do anything until I light it up. He pointed at it. What's in that thing? He asked. Oh, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, Madison replied with a smirk. Little recipe I learned out in the field. He cocked a brow skeptically. Can it get the job done? He asked. She nodded. Let's just say it's a good thing this house is made of brick, she said, looking around for effect. Or else, it might level it. So what you're saying is, I should say goodbye to my hearing? He asked dryly. She shrugged sheepishly. You weren't attached to it, were you? She teased. He chuckled. Guess not, he said, shaking his head. Any sign of our friends? She asked, sobering as she motioned to the front door. Nothing, he replied. Few more of those things joined the pack in the front, though. And the back? She asked. About the same, he said. She moved to the back window and peeked out discreetly through the blinds. This thing might be able to take out a majority of them, she said softly. But it doesn't really leave us any place to go. Atticus jerked a thumb over his shoulder. Side of the house? He suggested. And they shared a nod before heading to the bedroom at the far end of the house. They looked out the window there, and there were about 50 creatures right by the window, shambling back and forth, like they weren't sure if they should join the mob at the front or the back. Atticus looked at the window, however, and it was a bit smaller than normal. That is going to be a tight fit for us to get through in a hurry, he pointed out. Don't worry, Madison replied. If I got my measurements right, most of this wall is going to be gone once this goes off. He blinked at her. Thought you said it wouldn't bring down the house, he asked. She shrugged. Most of it will still be standing, she replied simply. He chuckled and rubbed his forehead. Okay, come on, he finally said. Let's make sure we're ready to roll before you light that thing up. They made their way back into the kitchen, loading up their gear, drinking a bit more water, and psyching themselves up for the battle that was to come. How's your ammo? Madison asked as she set down the jug of water she'd been drinking from. Mag and a half, Atticus replied as he slammed his back into his gun. You? About the same, she replied as she holstered her weapon. Saving bullets for the deserters? He suggested. She pursed her lips for a beat before looking up at him. Still think you're right about us being watched? She asked. He shrugged. If I'm wrong, I have no problem with you saying I told you so, he said, sealing the deal. She laughed. "Consider it done," she said, and they shook on it. "You have what you need to hotwire a vehicle?" he asked, "assuming we can find one." She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a screwdriver. "The older it is, the easier it is," she declared, wiggling the tool back and forth. "Good thing progress stopped hitting this town sometime in the early 90s, Atticus quipped. "You ready?" she asked. He nodded firmly. "Light it up," he said. Madison nodded and headed back into the bedroom. She opened up the window and put the cooler on the ledge. The zombies outside reacted immediately, shambling over to her and smacking their rotting hands against the cooler. "Patience," she cooed. "You'll have everything you can handle soon enough." She pulled out her lighter and flicked it on, hesitating just a moment to gather herself before putting flame to fuse and shoving the bomb out the window. As it hit the ground, she sprinted out of the bedroom and slammed the door shut behind her, tearing through the kitchen. Atticus watched her go by from behind the counter, pausing for a beat. He glanced at the bomb side of the house and then the direction she had run, then scrambled to his feet and took off after her into the far bedroom. She slammed the door behind him and threw her weight against it. "Is that necessary?" he asked, cocking a brow. She nodded jerkily. "Probably," she said. "Good enough for me," he said, and joined her against the door. Nothing happened, and his guts sank, wondering if it didn't work. He took a deep breath. "Is it?" "It's fine," she hissed. "Just give it a—" A deafening blast shook the entire house. The force of the blast on the door sent the pictures in the bedroom falling to the ground, and they covered their heads. After a brief moment, Madison pushed Atticus out of the way to open the door. They looked down the hallway towards the other bedroom, and it was a mess. Half the house had small fires sprouting up. Dust and debris covered every surface, and the other bedroom door was shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Come on," Madison hissed, and the two of them ran across the house. As they got closer to the explosion site, it was clear just how much damage it had done. Most of the outer wall was completely missing, with part of the roof beginning to cave in on that side. The zombies that were there had been completely obliterated. There were body parts scattered on the ground, some major strains on the house across from them, and some dangled bodies still moving around. Brains somehow not destroyed by the blast. "That did the trick," Atticus quipped. Before they could get too far outside, the moans coming from the front and back of the house intensified. "Not on them," Madison said, shaking her head. "Come on." The duo ran towards the back of the house, diagonally away from it. When they made it a few steps away, the massive mob of ghouls in the backyard began to emerge, letting out excited moans as they spotted their fresh meal. The two of them ran as hard as they could, with the neighborhood to their left and the downtown area to their right. The explosion had alerted every zombie in town where they were, and they were all coming their way. The creatures emerged from the alleyways and the side streets of downtown, which were about 30 yards away from the houses they were running by. They got to the next block, looking down the streets, seeing an army of undead to their right into town, but only a few dozen to their left, most of which were shambling towards the house they'd just blown up. They started running down the street, looking around for a vehicle that they could commandeer. They stopped at the first intersection, looking around and seeing nothing but zombies, some of which were turning around at the sound of their boots on the pavement. "We gotta get deeper into the neighborhood," Madison huffed, eyes wide. "I wouldn't have time to start it even if we found something." Atticus nodded, motioning. "Let's get off the road too," he suggested, "making too much noise." They headed to the grass, getting a couple houses deep on the road before working their way back through the houses. They hopped a few fences and got through the next street without much conflict. The majority of zombies had moved away, drawn by the explosion. It wasn't long before they spotted an old sedan sitting in the driveway of a house, with only a couple of creatures shambling around it. "Let's take 'em out and get out of here," Atticus said. Madison nodded firmly. "Lead the way," she said. They broke from cover, dispatching the creatures with a simple knife to the skull. Atticus stood guard as Madison made quick work of the vintage sedan's steering column. A few moments later, the car sprung to life. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, feathering the gas pedal and letting the engine warm up. "Looks like we have most of a tank of gas," she called. "Should get you to North Platte in one piece." Atticus didn't answer, standing with his back to her and staring up into the sky. His shoulders were stiff, and she could almost smell the anxiety flowing off of him in waves. "What is it?" she asked, her own body tightening. He pointed up, and she got out of the car, following his finger. She clenched her jaw at the sight of what he'd spotted. "Well, that explains why they weren't shooting at us," she muttered. There was a small commercial drone hovering in the air just above them, the camera looking straight down at the duo and their freshly started car. "We need to go," Atticus said. "I'll drive," Madison said, and they scrambled into the sedan. She punched the gas, the tires squealing as it backed out of the driveway, turning towards the end of the road a few blocks down. As she sped towards it, her passenger quickly buckling his seatbelt. "I'm not that bad of a driver," she quipped. "More concerned about the off-roading we're about to do," he replied, shooting her a knowing glance. She laughed. "Oh, right," she replied, and shoved her own seatbelt into place as they got to the end of the road. She gripped the steering wheel tightly and hit the grass to get away from the barricade, the car bouncing violently on the uneven ground as she tried to keep a good pace. Their time was severely limited. Finally, they made it to the highway and headed to the northwest. Atticus rolled down the window, looking back towards town. It was difficult to make out, but he was sure the drone was there in the sky following them. "Is there any way they know where we're headed?" he asked as he straightened in his seat. "This highway runs straight to North Platte," Madison replied, shaking her head. He took a deep breath, drumming his fingers on his thigh. "They may not have hard proof I came from there, but they have to have suspected someone from the military would eventually come investigate after the communications went down," he mused. "We need to play it like they know," she said firmly. "If we're wrong, so be it, but I'd rather plan for the worst." "Same here," he agreed, leaning his head back against the seat and glancing at her. "So, how do we play it?" "Not much on the highway between here and North Platte," she admitted with a shrug. "Just some tiny one-stoplight kind of towns." He nodded slowly. "Let's get to one. I might have an idea of how we can lose them." Chapter 3. Madison and Atticus continued to tear down the highway towards North Platte. While she drove at relatively unsafe speeds, he continued to keep an eye on their six, making sure they were keeping ahead of the ex-soldiers. "We're coming up on Wellfleet in a couple of miles," she said. "Getting close to North Platte," he murmured. She cocked a brow in surprise. "Been to Wellfleet, have you?" she asked. He nodded. "It was my first stop after I arrived," he explained. "Ran into that same group that took Jean." She blinked rapidly, shaking her head. "What were they doing in Wellfleet?" she asked. "They had a supply stash there," Atticus said. She nodded slowly. "Doesn't surprise me," she admitted. "They're probably like us and have stuff tucked away all over the region. No sense in risking everything by having it all together." He side-glanced her, asking a question he'd been wanting to ask for a while. "So, if they do force you out of here, where are you now? You'll have places to go?" "In the short term, yeah," she said, then huffed a sigh. "But it would just be delaying the inevitable. We don't have a fallback home base, just smaller satellite farms and one stoplight town stashed away with goods. They'd be able to make short work of us if we had to split up." He nodded. "Hopefully you can hold them off in Wichita," he said gently. "I mean, if you wanted to get really bold, you could use their plan against them." Madison paused, cocking her head. "How?" she finally asked. "Send a team to the east side and clear the barricade," he suggested, motioning with his hands as he spoke. "Send those things away from you." "It's risky, but it might come down to that," she said, nodding slowly as she thought more about it. "Don't suppose you could put in a missile strike request for us? Take out the barricade?" He chuckled. "I think you overestimate my pull," he said with an apologetic shake of his head. "If you need a few extra rations when you come to Seattle, I can make that happen. Raining hellfire from above? Probably not." "Well, I'm hoping you have a little more sway than just getting seconds with dinner," she said dryly. "You see what we're up against here." He took a deep breath. "Don't worry, I'll make a convincing case to send help up here," he promised, and hoped it was one he would be able to keep. She nodded as the tiny town of Wellfleet emerged on the horizon. There weren't any zombies in their field of vision, just a vast emptiness. "Stay sharp," Madison said. Atticus nodded, gripping his assault rifle. He kept his eyes trained on the horizon, looking for any potential threat. It didn't take him long to spot something, a slight shimmer coming from the roof of a building. "Sniper," he warned, and Madison immediately swerved. This caused the sniper to act, shooting towards them and hitting the back passenger window, busting it out. Madison drove into the field, swerving as the rough terrain made it difficult to control the vehicle. Another shot impacted them, narrowly missing Atticus, who was keeping watch on the horizon for more enemy movement. Madison, meanwhile, picked up the speed, trying to get to the outer edge of downtown for some cover from the buildings. The next shot hit the front tire, the rubber exploding instantly. She nearly lost control of the car as it spun out on the rough terrain. It lifted up off of the ground for a brief moment, but settled back down hard rather than flip over. She kept the gas pedal down to get them to the side of the two-story business, stopping just short. Both of them climbed out through the driver's side door, not wanting to give the sniper a shot. They raised their weapons in opposite directions to cover each other. "How many did you see?" she demanded. "Just the sniper," he replied. She nodded. "He might be a scout," she said. "Let's take him out before reinforcements arrive." "I'll follow your lead," Atticus said, inclining his head for her to go first. Madison nodded and led them up the side of the building. They got to the corner and looked out, not seeing the sniper who had been a couple of blocks over. "How do you feel about being bait?" Madison murmured. Atticus sighed. "No foreplay, just straight to it, huh?" he joked. "Can you do it?" she asked with zero amusement in her tone. "Yeah, where do you need me?" he asked. She motioned in the direction she wanted to go. "I need him to pop up, so I can take him out," she explained. "I'm going to get on top of the building here, so I can be in line with him." He nodded slowly as he caught what she was getting at. "So, if I can get up to this building," he asked. "He'll have to expose himself to get an angle on you," she finished, confirming his theory. "Just don't miss," he warned, and she nodded before running off to the back of the building, keeping her assault rifle in the attack position, just in case the sniper wasn't alone. She made it to the back of the building, making the turn down the alleyway and finding it completely empty. Madison looked around for a way up to the top, finally spotting a built-in ladder about halfway down, but it had a protective cage over the bottom of it to prevent average people from climbing up on it. She rushed over, building up a head of steam before leaping up as she got close. She got high enough to grab the top of the protective covering, managing to pull herself up enough to grab onto one of the rungs. She quickly ascended to the top, staying as low as she could once she was there, immediately getting onto her stomach and crawling across the top. It took several moments, but finally she was at the edge of the building. Madison aimed her rifle in the direction the sniper had been, but couldn't get a read on him. She scanned the rooftops carefully, finally seeing his gun popping out from the lip of a building. It wasn't a flat top, rather one that looked like it had a foot-tall barrier around the edge. She aimed her rifle right at his head, but there was only a couple of inches of it popping up from behind cover. "You're good enough to make that shot," she murmured to herself. She tried to convince herself to make the shot, but she knew if she missed that he'd be in the wind, and she might not get a second chance before reinforcements arrived. She let out a deep breath. "Okay, Atticus, it's on you," she whispered. The man in question was on the ground, working his way towards the sniper, taking his time so that Madison was in position before he started getting shot at. He paused at the next intersection, looking down the road and seeing nothing but emptiness. No zombies, no bodies, no nothing. It looked like some higher power had snapped their fingers and everything vanished from town. Atticus aimed his rifle towards the rooftops as he ran across the street. He knew he didn't have much chance of hitting the sniper, but it would hopefully be enough of a deterrent to pin the enemy down so he could get to safety. Atticus made it to the next block, moving up alongside the buildings until he reached the corner. He looked up and spotted the tiniest bit of a rifle barrel sticking over the edge of the rooftop. He took a few moments to gather himself, knowing that this was going to be incredibly dangerous. Before moving, he looked down the road, making sure nobody else was aiming to take a potshot at him. From this vantage point, he appeared as though all the storefronts were locked up tight. No signs of entry. "Okay, Madison, you better be in position," he thought, and steadied himself, aiming his rifle up towards the sniper above. He didn't have a clean shot at him, but he hoped that by shooting it would give her a clear shot. He squeezed the trigger, sending a few rounds towards the rifle barrel. As it impacted the edge of the rooftop, the rifle disappeared from the edge, and a split second later, the sniper appeared, aiming down towards him. The sniper had Atticus right in his sights, and the ex-ranger stood his ground so he could give Madison as big of an opening as he could. Before the sniper could pull the trigger, his face exploded in an array of blood and bone. He stood there, staggered, gun dropping to the rooftop, wobbling for a moment before falling forward, the body landing hard on the pavement below with a satisfying splat. Atticus worked his way over to him, rifle at the ready just in case he miraculously had survived. When he got up, it was clear the man was a mangled mess and was no longer a threat to anybody. "That's what you get for taking a shot at us," the ex-ranger said bitterly. A loud whistle echoed on the wind, and he turned to look up in the direction Madison was. As he did so, he spotted a dirt bike sitting in the alleyway. He ran over to it, finding the key still in the ignition. "That could be useful," he said, before another loud whistle cut through the air, followed by some frantic yelling. Atticus broke away from the bike and ran back towards where Madison was, just as she whistled from the rooftops above. "Nice shooting," he called when he caught sight of her. She leaned over, shaking her head. "We're not out of this yet," she called back, and pointed towards the highway. "How close?" Atticus asked. She tilted her head back and forth. "Few miles at most," she said. "I can see them through the scope, and they're hauling ass." "You stay up there and lie low," he instructed. "I'll get them away from here." She scowled. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "I found the sniper's dirt bike," he explained, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "I can get to North Platte and pull them with me." "Hell no," she snapped. "I'll keep them pinned down here so you can get away." "I have a plan. I just need you to trust me," he said. "Stay low. I'll pull them away, and you get back to your people. They're going to need you." She hesitated, debating with herself for a moment, but it was clear there was no time to continue the argument. Finally, she relented with a grunt, tossing down her extra magazine of ammunition. "You just hurry back with reinforcements," she said firmly. "It's been a pleasure," Atticus said as he caught the magazine, shooting her his signature charming smile. Yeah, just get a move on," she barked. But she smiled back at him, and he gave her a tip of his hat before taking off towards the bike. He jumped on smoothly, started it up, and let it purr for a beat. "This is not the best idea you've had, Atticus," he thought to himself as he sat at the edge of the alleyway, waiting on the two SUVs filled with men who wanted him dead to get closer. When they were within visual range, he pulled out, stopping in the middle of the highway that cut through town. He took off his assault rifle, aiming towards the mini-convoy and firing a couple of times. As the bullets punched the vehicle, their engines roared as they picked up speed. He quickly slung the rifle back over his shoulder and hit the accelerator, speeding down the highway out of town. When he made it a half-mile, he glanced back to make sure both of the vehicles were following him, and they were right on target. "There you go, Madison," he thought triumphantly. "Get home safe." He sped down the road, passing the sign boasting North Platte, 20 miles. 20 miles to go, he thought to himself. That's how far you have to come up with a plan. Chapter 4. Atticus was within a mile of the North Platte train yard, and the two SUVs were still pursuing him, about a half-mile behind. The dirt bike thankfully provided way more speed than he'd initially anticipated. "You better figure out something quick," he muttered to himself, racking his brain for ideas. He knew he couldn't just make a run for the train. If the ex-soldiers got a hold of Bill and the transport, he'd have no way to get back home. No, his only chance was to lose them in the train yard. "This is a terrible idea," he told himself, shaking his head. "Worst one you've had this week, and that's saying something." He knew he had to go straight into the heart of it, and do it quickly. He spotted the edge of the train yard, with dozens of creatures packed in and moving around. He rode up to the fence where he'd broken through the first time, the sound of the dirt bike engine drawing way more attention than he would have liked. But luckily, the closest zombie was still about 20 yards from his entry point. Atticus got up there, dropping the bike to the ground, and rushed over to the fence, slipping underneath it. He was immediately greeted by a chorus of moans and a mob of ghouls shambling towards him. He knew he had mere seconds before soldiers were in range to open fire, so he had to act accordingly. The closest rail car was about 50 yards from him, with a couple dozen creatures standing between him and his cover. Atticus lowered his shoulder and barreled over a couple of ghouls, breaking through the next line. There were several outstretched arms coming towards him, and he managed to duck under and around them. There was a solid wall of creatures up next, too thick to be able to break through on his own, and too wide to sidestep as they were flanked by a couple of smaller packs. Atticus had no choice but to raise his assault rifle and pop off a few rounds, even though he was running low on ammunition. A few creatures dropped, giving him enough space to plow through them and get to the other side. The train car was within view, and it was a boxcar with open doors on either side. As he approached, he could see zombies on the other side as well. He ran and jumped up, quickly getting to his feet and not pausing as a couple of shots rang out from behind him. The bullets smacked into the rail car as he was now high enough that the soldiers had a shot at him. Atticus darted across the interior of the train car, jumping as far as he could, managing to barely clear the zombies on that side of the train. He landed awkwardly, stumbling and falling to the ground. However, he caught himself with his free hand. The creatures he leapt over were excited and moving towards him, and he felt the gentle swipe of a rotted hand on his back as he got to his feet and moved away, mere inches away from the disaster. He navigated the next few rows of train cars, which didn't have many ghouls around. He finally got up to the row right before the 2-story office building, with nothing but a smattering of ghouls out front, nothing he couldn't handle. He picked up a rock, throwing it over the heads of the zombies in front of the door, managing to smack it against the top of the train car and sending a high metallic clang into the air. He waited a few moments before the creatures shambled away from the door. He walked over to the door, slipping in unnoticed and securing it behind him. Most of the creatures that had come into the building the last time he was there had since found their way back out to the yard. Atticus knew he was outnumbered and was going to need as much help as he could get. He headed over to the stairwell, grabbing a nearby chair and using it to prop the door open. He let out a whistle, smacking on the door a bit to get the attention of the ghouls. "Yeah, that's right. Come on over," he called. About 24 zombies that were near the far broken window began to shamble over. He stood there for several moments, making sure they were close enough to continue on their path once he left. Once he was confident, he ran up the stairs to the second floor, rushing over to the window and taking up a position behind a wall, looking out. In the distance, he could see the 2 SUVs with the deserters hiding behind it, none of them coming after him. "What are you boys up to?" he murmured to himself, scanning the yard. He looked for a reason, any explanation, scanning the distance to make sure there wasn't a sniper. Finally, over the moaning coming from the stairwell, he could hear a faint whizzing noise. He looked out the window, spotting a small drone hovering just above the ground, about 15 yards away from the window. He smirked before extending his hand and middle finger. "Come and get me, boys," he spat, and raised his assault rifle, taking aim and firing a single round that destroyed the drone, sending it crashing to the ground. "Going to have to do it on your own, though." He took a step back, grabbing one of the heavy chairs and sending it flying towards the window, shattering it. He stood there in the opening for a moment, staring at the soldiers as they gathered themselves for an assault. He checked his ammunition, 5 more rounds in his current magazine, so he swapped it out for one of the 2 full ones he had. "Better make every shot count," he said to himself, and took a step to the side, taking cover against the wall and waiting for the assault to begin. Chapter 5. Atticus took a knee, looking through his scope directly towards the 2 SUVs where a couple of kill teams were preparing to storm the train yard. His mind raced, trying to figure out what he could do to get any sort of advantage. He noticed a large pile of rebar near the part of the fence he'd come in at, and aimed his rifle, firing a single shot towards it. The bullet impacted, making a loud metallic ping, drawing even more creatures towards the opening. "It's not much, but that ought to slow you down a bit," he thought to himself. He continued aiming downrange, just waiting for one of the soldiers to pop their head out from behind a vehicle. He didn't have to wait long. 4 gunmen popped out from behind cover, 2 on each side, all 4 of them opening fire on Atticus's position. While it was a difficult shot to make, it was more than enough to force him back behind cover. Bullets ripped through the opening, hitting the glass on the next 2 windows and pinging off of desks inside the office. The gunfire outside intensified as they approached the fence, 4 of the men shooting the zombies near the fence, while 2 more continued providing cover fire. Atticus peeked around the corner to see what kind of situation he was dealing with. There were 7 men total, the 6 leading the raid on the compound, and a sniper that was set up on the top of the SUVs. It was a risky move on the sniper's part to be set up in the open, but Atticus assumed it was because they doubted he could shoot that far accurately. He was forced to duck back behind cover when one of the sniper shots bounced off of the wall, barely missing him. "Oh, that's how it's going to be, huh?" he asked out loud. "Okay." He hugged the wall as he retreated back into the darkness of the building, staying low behind the cubicle walls for cover. He ran as hard as he could to the other side of the building, then up the far side towards the windows, up to the one he'd smashed out during his first visit to the office building. He lay on his stomach, crawling up towards the edge, but staying in the darkness as much as he could. Finally, he got into position beside a potted plant, which added a bit of extra coverage. He carefully aimed his rifle towards the sniper, knowing he only got 1 shot at this. He took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger, sending a round towards him. The sniper took the bullet right on the top of the head, sending a large spurt of blood flying up as he fell lifelessly on the top of the vehicle. "That's what you get for underestimating me," he muttered, and quickly popped up, getting behind the cover of the wall and looking down at the situation on the ground. The 6 remaining soldiers were moving up the rail yard quickly, putting down zombies as they came across them, apparently unconcerned about the amount of ammunition they were spending. He took a knee and took aim, waiting for the group to come around the corner of the next train car, which had a dozen zombies behind it. A couple of the soldiers got into the train car, unloading on the ghouls from above, while the other 4 men came around the side. Atticus sent several rounds towards them, catching one of them in the vest and another in the head. He was immediately greeted with a volley of gunfire that forced him back inside the building. 5 more, he quipped, and leaned back out from behind cover, sending a few more shots towards the oncoming soldiers. But the 4 that hadn't been hit were still moving forward and had reached the final row of train cars. He looked back and saw that the one he'd got in the vest was moving a bit slower than the others and was a row behind them. Unbeknownst to him, there was a pack of ghouls coming up from his blind side. Atticus took advantage of the situation, aiming for his lower body and sending several shots towards him. Most of the bullets hit the ground, but one of them caught him in the leg, sending him to the ground in pain. The creatures came around the corner, laying eyes on their prize and descending down on him. He screamed as his flesh ripped from his bones, drawing his handgun and trying to shoot, but losing his gun as zombies bit into his arm and throat. Atticus couldn't admire his handiwork for too long, as he heard gunfire coming from inside the building. He ran towards the stairwell door, knowing that was where the fight was going to be. He reached it, and the gunfire intensified, as well as the moaning from the ghouls echoing inside the stairwell. He cracked open the door just a bit and saw a zombie on the second-floor landing that was shambling back towards the stairs. He quickly darted out, grabbing the creature and pinning him against the back wall. The zombie had been an average-sized man when it was alive, so it was nothing that Atticus couldn't handle. He waited there, listening for the gunfire to get close enough. Finally, he heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots in the stairwell, followed by a couple of voices barking out signals to each other. He spun around, using his momentum to throw the zombie over the railing towards the opening of the door. As the creature flew through the air, he slung his rifle back around to his hands, getting over to the railing and aiming down. The blind toss was a great one, landing right on top of one of the soldiers, who crumpled under the weight. The other soldier continued firing at the other creatures in the stairwell, because if he stopped, they'd be overwhelmed. The man who'd been taken out by the flying zombie let out a scream as the creature bit into his shoulder. As his partner turned to help, Atticus fired, pumping the soldier with several shots in the head area. He ran empty on the magazine, popping it out and putting in his last full one. As he did that, the last 2 soldiers came into the stairwell, one shooting up towards Atticus and forcing him back into the second-floor office, while the other finished off the creatures in there. He also popped the bitten soldier in the head before they moved up the stairs. Atticus ran to the middle of the room, ducking down behind some cubicles, listening for the soldiers to come in. As soon as the door opened, he leaned around the corner and fired several times at the door, greeted with return fire. Everybody missed, but in the moment Atticus ducked down to take cover, the 2 soldiers entered the room and split up. Atticus moved through the aisles of cubicles, trying to figure out his next move. He figured they were going to try and flank him, so he made a rush towards the stairwell wall, keeping his rifle raised and ready. Sure enough, one of the soldiers came around the corner and they exchanged fire. Atticus's bullet was sent to mass, hitting the soldier in the vest just as he fired, causing him to miss badly. Atticus didn't let up, knowing that the vest wasn't a kill shot, so he kept sending rounds towards him, hitting him in the chest several more times before he managed to land a headshot. As he did, the last remaining soldier came out from behind him at the far end of the aisle. A bullet grazed Atticus's arm, literally missing a debilitating shot by a fraction of an inch. The ex-ranger popped up, sending a few rounds downrange as he ran towards the window side of the room. They exchanged more shots as they ran, pinning each other down back and forth as they moved in a deadly dance. Atticus's gun went click, and he had to put in the magazine with only 5 bullets in it. He knew he had to be on top of it if he was going to get out of this alive. He took up a position next to a busted-out window, trying hard to listen for the soldier's movements, straining his ears but unable to get a read on him. Finally, several shots came through the cubicle, hitting the rifle and sending it out the window. Atticus hit the ground, letting out a grunt, and the soldier practically flew around the corner in a hurry at the noise. Atticus managed to pop up, flinging his arms upwards and catching the gun as it went off, sending a would-be kill shot into the cubicle wall. The ex-ranger rushed forward, slamming into his significantly larger opponent with enough force to get him to drop the rifle. The two of them struggled for a moment, grappling with each other to find their footing and hand positions, before the soldier spun Atticus around and delivered a sharp gut shot. The impact knocked the wind out of Atticus, causing him to stumble back. Both men stood there for a moment, sizing each other up. The soldier drew a large knife, brandishing it, and Atticus looked over to the desk, spotting a large red stapler. He grabbed it, unfurled it, and readied for the attack. The soldier darted forward, swinging the knife across his body. Atticus leaned back to avoid it, then retaliated by swinging the stapler, catching the soldier on the cheek. His opponent let out a horror laugh, like he was amused that Atticus was able to draw blood. He stepped back, grabbing the bloody staple and ripping it from his face, tossing it to the side. The soldier rushed forward, leaping into the air and delivering a double-booted front kick to Atticus, who was caught completely off guard. The impact was dramatic, causing a bit of whiplash as he flung to the ground. Atticus was always up for a fight, but he knew he was at a disadvantage there. He got back to his feet as the other man did the same, readying his knife to gut Atticus with. He looked at the soldier, the rage and near enjoyment of it all in his eyes, then looked behind him at the open window. The soldier let out a yell, and Atticus did the same before throwing the stapler at the man's head, catching him off guard. As he smacked it out of the way, the ex-ranger lunged forward, putting every bit of strength he had into it. He lowered his shoulder, executing a textbook football tackle, putting his shoulder into the man's gut and wrapping him up while driving him backwards. The move was unexpected, and the soldier was backpedaling. Atticus made sure to hold the man up as he shoved him backwards towards the busted-out window, which was just a couple of yards away at this point. By the time the soldier could regain his footing, it was too late. Atticus drove them both over the edge, unwrapping his arms from the man's back and grabbing onto the front of him as they fell. The man screamed, cutting short from the massive thud and crunch as they impacted the ground. The ex-ranger groaned as his shoulder dislocated from the impact, and he rolled off of the soldier, who was broken and wheezing for air. Atticus looked around, finding a lot of zombie corpses, but he could hear the sound of rapid footsteps. He managed to turn himself over, muffling the pain from his shoulder, and crawled along the ground to get underneath the nearby train car. As he did, a runner zombie emerged from around the corner, the wounds on his body still fresh, staining his uniform and bulletproof vest. Atticus glanced back towards the soldier he'd ridden down from the second floor, watching as he tried to move, but couldn't as the runner sprinted towards him. The man tried to let out a scream, but it came out as a squeaky wheeze as the creature pounced on top of him to begin ripping into his body. Atticus cautiously continued moving, staying as quiet as he could, luckily drowned out by the sounds of excited moaning and the gargles from the dying man. The ex-ranger got to his feet, looking around for a threat, but didn't see any as the soldiers had done a great job of wiping them out. He moved quickly towards the train yard, heading for the SUVs. He got to the fence, climbing out underneath it and accidentally letting it slam back into place. A moment later, he looked back and the runner was sprinting towards him. He didn't panic, however, just walked over to the SUVs that were in the middle of the fence line. He watched the runner smack up against the chain link, thrashing about like a psychopath, trying to get to him. "Not today, my friend," he drawled. "Not today." He got into the SUV, relieved to find the keys in the ignition. He started it up, taking a moment to catch his breath before popping it into gear and heading to the rendezvous. Atticus drove along the road, in a lot of pain and exhausted, but focused. When he got tired, he gave his dislocated shoulder a bit of a wiggle, the excruciating sensation tingling throughout his body and quickly waking him back up. It took him the better part of an hour to reach the train, thankful to see it still in the distance. As he began to pull up, he laid on the horn. Bill let out a return toot of the train horn. Atticus pulled up, nearly collapsing out of the SUV. Bill jumped down immediately and rushed over. "Holy hell, brother! What happened to you?" he cried.
"You remember the rumors of trouble in Kansas?"
Atticus groaned. Bill blinked at him. "Yeah?" he replied.
"Rode part of that trouble out of a second-story window,"
the ex-ranger said, and though his voice was strained, he managed to grin. The engineer shook his head, then noticed the odd angle of the other man's shoulder. "Okay, I need you to hold real still for me," he instructed.
"What are you doing?"
Atticus asked warily. "Gonna pop that back into place," Bill said. "Gonna hurt worse than a swift kick to the jimmy, but it needs to be done." The ex-ranger gritted his teeth and nodded, waiting and bracing himself. The engineer yanked down on his shoulder, and Atticus let out a pained grunt as it popped back into the socket. "We're going to stop in Moorcroft. Let Linda's people take a look at you," Bill declared. The ex-ranger shook his head as he stood up fully.
"I have to get back to Seattle," he insisted. "It's urgent."
"I said we're going to stop in Moorcroft and let Linda's people take a look at you," Bill said firmly, leaving no room for argument. "Either you do it my way, or you can hitchhike back." Atticus closed his eyes for a beat, because he knew his friend was right, and he did need a proper once-over. Despite his panic at needing to get back as soon as possible, he decided not to fight it, and nodded.
"Okay, you win," he agreed. "But a quick once-over, and we're out, agreed?"
Bill grinned. "Agreed," he said. "Now come on, I want you to sit up front with me. Gotta keep an eye on you, 'cause you look like you got the holy hell knocked out of you."
"Just a little concussion and internal bleeding," Atticus quipped. "Nothing I haven't had before."
"And since you're listening to me, you'll be alive to get them in the future," Bill shot back. "Now come on, we got some miles to cover." The ex-ranger nodded, and his friend helped him up into the train to get ready to head back up the tracks to Moorcroft. Chapter 6. Atticus was sitting in a medical bed, his arm in a sling as he nursed a bottle of water. Linda and Bill were standing beside him as they waited for the doctor to come back in. "You are a maniac, you realize that, don't you?" Linda huffed, crossing her arms. He half shrugged and shot her a smirk.
"Stairs are overrated,"
he drawled. The other two just chuckled, shaking their heads, and the doctor returned. She was a younger woman, looking to be in her late 20s, with long brown hair. She was carrying a clipboard and a couple of bottles of pills. "Okay, Mr. Windward, given everything you've been through, you're in surprisingly good shape," she said. He offered a self-deprecating smile.
"Wish I felt that way,"
he said. She held up a bottle of pills and shook it lightly. "That's why I have these for you," she said. "They'll help with the pain."
"Don't need 'em,"
he replied, shaking his head. She stared at him sternly. "Mr. Windward."
"Atticus,"
he corrected. "Atticus," she said, voice firm. "You have a dislocated shoulder, some head trauma that may or may not be a concussion, and pretty confident you have a few cracked ribs as well. And that doesn't include the various scrapes, cuts, and bruises. These are going to help you." He shook his head.
"Doc, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, but I promise you that I don't need them," he said.
She sighed.
"Doc, tell me something," he cut in. "How's your supply on those?"
She hesitated a moment, chewing over his question before admitting. "Not as many as I would like."
"That's what I thought," he quipped. "The supply you have now is all you're ever going to get. The places that made that stuff aren't operational, and most likely the people who made it are gone too. Now, I've been through worse in my time, and I can manage the pain. I want you to save those for someone who really needs it."
The doctor stared him down for a moment, at the look of seriousness in his eyes, and finally let out a deep breath. "Okay, but," she said with a sigh, and opened the bottle, shaking a couple of pills free into her palm and holding them out. "You're not walking out of here without taking one dose."
"Doc,"
he warned. "Either you take them now, or I start breaking stuff until you're in enough pain that you need them," she said firmly. He chuckled, eyebrows rising. He nodded and took the pills, downing them with his water.
"You good with that?"
he asked. "I suppose that will have to do," she huffed. "Now, do you want to hear my recommendations, or shall we skip straight to the part where you ignore them?" He couldn't help but smirk at her, but he winced in pain, lessening the effect.
"I'm sure you're going to recommend bed rest for a few days, but that's a luxury I don't have," he admitted.
"I'll take it a little slower around the curve so we can rest a bit more comfortably," Bill piped up.
"You'll do no such thing,"
Atticus said, shaking his head.
"That's wasting time we don't have."
"If a couple of hours is going to doom everybody, then we're already in a heap of trouble," the engineer shot back. Linda's brow furrowed deeply. "What kind of trouble are you two talking about?" she demanded.
"Honestly, I don't think it's going to impact you,"
Atticus said. She jutted out her chin in defiance. "Humor me," she said flatly.
"Those military deserters in Kansas?"
the ex-ranger asked, and she nodded.
"Appears as though there's a lot more of them than we had anticipated, but they have their hands full down there, so I don't think they're coming up this way anytime soon."
She put her hands on her hips. "Do I have to worry about the military guys that are already here?" she asked. The men exchanged a concerned look, and Atticus immediately began to get up from the bed. He moved slowly, cursing his body, wincing in pain. "Slow down," the doctor chastised. "All that adrenaline has worn off, and you've been sitting for too long. You're going to be feeling it for a while, even after those pills kick in." He nodded, offering her an appreciative smile.
"Thanks, Doc,"
he said, then turned to Linda.
"Come on, let's go have a chat with them. And Bill, get the train ready, because we need to take off right after I'm done with them."
The engineer nodded and headed off to prepare the train as Atticus and Linda made their way slowly through town, back to the house where the soldiers were. Atticus stumbled a bit, and Linda gasped, catching him and putting his good arm around her shoulders. "This better not be a smooth move to get me closer to you," she said, but there was amusement in her tone, laced with worry for his health. He smiled.
"I would totally jump out of a second-floor window for you," he drawled.
She chuckled. "Settle down there, cowboy," she said, patting his chest lightly. "We got work to do."
"Yes, ma'am,"
he replied, and they walked about a block in silence, Atticus just focusing on moving without the pain keeling him over. Linda seemed to notice his plight and began to engage in conversation to distract him while the pills could kick in. "So, you're going to make sure these guys aren't going to do us any harm?" she asked.
"That's not why I want to talk to them," he admitted, only wincing a little as he shook his head. "I'm pretty confident that they're on the up and up."
Her brow furrowed. "What makes you say that?" she asked.
"Every bit of info they gave me was spot on," he explained. "If they had nefarious intentions, they could have very easily sent me on a wild goose chase instead of putting me on the right path."
She nodded slowly, though she still seemed wary. "I'm going to follow your lead," she finally said. "If you think they're good, I'll back it."
"Good, because I'm going to ask them to stay in town,"
Atticus admitted. She stiffened, though tried not to shift his body too much. "Not so sure that's a good idea," she said.
"How many trained fighters do you have here in town?"
he asked. She paused, swallowing hard as they continued their slow walk. "That would be none," she admitted.
"These guys have spent every day fighting and fortifying places against attack," he pressed on. "Even though it's a very, very remote chance that you ever see one of those deserters, I'd feel a lot more comfortable if you had some defenders here, at least until we can get you some reinforcements."
She didn't say anything for a time, chewing over his words, and finally nodded in agreement. "Okay," she said. "Now all you have to do is convince them." They finally reached the house and approached the door. Linda knocked, and Private Harbin answered the door. He immediately blinked in shock at Atticus. "Dude, are you okay?" he blurted. The ex-ranger offered a self-deprecating smile.
"Yeah, it turns out they aren't very welcoming of newcomers down there in Kansas," he drawled.
"Come on in, get comfortable," Harbin said, stepping aside and opening the door wide. "You want a drink or anything?" He jerked a thumb in the direction of the kitchen.
"Water would be great,"
Atticus said, and let Linda support him into the house. "Yeah, I'll grab it," Harbin said, and headed off. Linda closed the door behind them, and the duo entered the living room area. Private Cobb was lying on the couch, but he immediately sat up at the sight of the wounded man, shoving over so they could sit. "Holy hell, you okay?" Cobb asked.
"Never better,"
Atticus quipped. Harbin entered with a bottle of water and handed it over to the ex-ranger, who took it gratefully with a smile. Atticus looked around.
"First off, how's your friend doing?" he asked.
"He's better," Cobb replied. "We're ready to go whenever you are, sir." The ex-ranger shook his head slightly, trying not to wince.
"I don't think that'll be necessary," he said. "I have a different mission for you."
Harbin raised a questioning eyebrow. Can you give us missions?" he asked slowly.
"I'm giving this one, and if they want me to keep doing dangerous stuff like this, then they'll let it slide,"
Atticus declared. Harbin shared a look with Cobb and then shrugged. "Works for me," he said. "What do you need us to do?" Cobb asked.
"It's unlikely, but sooner or later some of the people who did this to me might work their way up here,"
the ex-ranger explained, motioning to himself.
"I want you to stay here to fortify the town. Train people to fight back if that day ever comes. What do you say?"
The two soldiers exchanged another look, then Harbin turned to Linda, his voice firm but respectful. "We'll do it on one condition," he said. "We're allowed full freedom in the town. No more house confinement." Cobb nodded, raising his hand. "I second that," he said. "If we're treated as equals, I'm in." She folded her hands in her lap. "I can grant you that," she said slowly, taking a deep breath. "Just some of the townsfolk might take some time to warm up to the idea." "You're doing everything you can," Harbin said. "That's all we ask."
"So, you'll do it?"
Atticus asked before taking another swig of his water. Cobb nodded. "Yeah, we'll do it," he promised.
"There's something else I need," the ex-ranger said.
"Name it," Harbin replied, leaning forward so his elbows were on his thighs.
"In about a week or so, I want one of you to take a ride up to Helena,"
Atticus explained.
"I'll have some documents made up in Seattle and sent back down to you, saying you're picking up some supplies for town. Make it look all official, but I want you to ask around to the soldiers up there. Hint that you're looking for something different."
"What kind of different?" Cobb asked, cocking his head a little.
"Like you're looking for a new life,"
Atticus explained, waving a hand vaguely.
"My fear is that there are recruiters for the deserters in the ranks already. Need to figure out how to root them out, or find a way to get a man on the inside. So if you find somebody, be non-committal and report back."
Cobb nodded firmly. "We can do that," he said.
"Okay,"
the ex-ranger said, draining the last of his water bottle.
"In that case, I'll leave you all to it. Lot of work to get done."
He grunted as he leaned forward to get up, and the soldiers beat Linda to helping him stand, both of them shaking his hand one after the other. "You get some rest, sir," Harbin said firmly. Atticus chuckled.
"As much rest as you can on a train cruising down the tracks," he said.
"I'll be back later today to discuss things in detail," Linda said as she took Atticus's arm to lead him back outside. Cobb nodded to her. "Look forward to it," he said. The two hobbled back to the train, where Bill had everything ready to go. Linda took Atticus up to his car and helped him up the stairs. "I had my people put a care package in there for you," she said. "Fresh bread and maybe a little something else." He smiled down at her.
"That's much appreciated,"
he drawled. "You be safe getting home," she said, clasping her hands together.
"Oh, you know me. Safest man in town,"
he joked, and she laughed as he disappeared into the car. She stepped down and looked at Bill hanging out the front window, giving him a thumbs up and a wave. A few moments later, the train started moving, chugging slowly down the tracks towards home. As Atticus slowly made his way into his car, Bill's voice crackled over the speaker system. "All right, buddy, get comfortable, get some sleep, and I'll have you back home before you know it," he said brightly. "We're going to be going straight through outside of a quick stop in Helena so I can grab my dinner. I'll call in an order for you, too. Now get comfy, 'cause we're out of here."
"Yeah,"
Atticus admitted out loud, even though the engineer couldn't hear him.
"Don't care how much of a hurry we're in. I could go for a hot meal."
He shambled over to his seat, smiling down at the basket of baked goods and water bottles. Next to the basket sat a slightly worn black cowboy hat, and he grinned as he picked it up and popped it on his head. It was a little loose, but it felt good to be wearing one again. He noticed that beneath the hat was a little folded piece of paper, and he unfolded it. "No cowboy should be without his hat," the note said, and he smiled, imagining thanking Linda properly for the thoughtful gift. He sat down, and his body protested loudly. He struggled to prop his feet up, but finally managed it, the position only slightly better than standing.
"Oh my God,"
he thought as he groaned, trying desperately to find a position that wasn't agony.
"I hate the world, and everything that dwells within it. I know I was trying to do the right thing, but it would be wonderful if those pills would kick in."
He couldn't help but chuckle to himself, shaking his head as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the thumb drive that Madison had given him. He stared at it for a moment.
"You'd better have some good stuff on you,"
he said, glaring daggers at the tiny piece of equipment.
"That's all I'm saying."
He put it back into his pocket, shifting around for another moment, until he decided there was zero chance of being actually comfortable, and he was just going to have to deal with it. He pulled his hat down over his eyes and tried to get a bit of rest. Chapter 7. Day 0 plus 47. Rebuild Day 17. Atticus sat up in his seat, eating a bit of bread with some preserves that were packed in his care package, watching the sun come up as they got close to Seattle. His wounds were beginning to calm down a bit, although things were still sore. He moved his formerly dislocated shoulder a bit, wincing in pain, but knowing he needed to keep it loose. "Just a couple minutes out," Bill said over the speaker, and Atticus gave the speaker in the corner a thumbs up. He looked outside, watching civilization come back into view. Soldiers and civilians moved about, most armed with melee weapons and moving goods around.
"Home sweet home,"
he murmured, and the train came to a complete stop. "Welcome home," Bill's voice came through. "Come up and see me before you head out." Atticus got up slowly. He retrieved his bag of items that was his payday after all this. He slung it over his good shoulder before grabbing the last bit of bread and preserves, cramming it into his mouth and savoring every bite of it as he made his way outside. As soon as his boots hit the ground, 2 soldiers stepped up to him. "Are you Atticus, sir?" one of them asked.
"I am,"
he replied with a nod. "We have a transport back to the command center," the soldier said, motioning behind him.
"All right,"
the ex-ranger said and handed over his bag.
"Just gotta talk to Bill, and we'll be on our way."
The soldier took the bag and nodded. "Of course, sir," he said. The cowboy hobbled his way towards the front of the train, where Bill jumped down and moved quickly towards him, so he didn't have to walk as far. "Hang on, I'm coming," the engineer called.
"I need to stretch out anyway,"
Atticus said, waving him off.
"Can't be walking into the command center looking like a broken-down old man now, can I?"
Bill laughed as they reached each other. "No, I don't suppose you can," he agreed. He extended his hand to shake. "Been a pleasure working with you this week." he said sincerely. "Whenever you need transport, just give me a shout."
"You'll be my first call,"
Atticus promised as they shook.
"I appreciate someone who does what they say they're going to do, especially when that involves camping out behind enemy lines."
"I get paid by the day, so if you want to find a little vacation spot you need me to hang out in for a few weeks, I'm your guy," Bill joked, and they shared a laugh.
"You got it,"
the ex-ranger said with the tip of his hat.
"I'll see you around."
"Give Clint and Gat my best," Bill said. Atticus nodded and walked back to the soldiers, who were waiting by the SUV. They opened the back door for him, and he got situated as they loaded up.
"So, tell me, boys, what's new in the Pacific Northwest?"
Atticus asked as they pulled away from the train station. "What's the old saying?" the driver replied. "Same shit, different day." The passenger soldier barked a laugh. "Yeah, that about sums it up, sir," he agreed.
"So morale isn't the highest, then?"
Atticus asked. The two soldiers exchanged an awkward look and didn't say anything. The ex-ranger noticed and raised a hand.
"Don't worry, I don't even know your names," he said gently. "I'm pretty sure I have a concussion to go along with the very strong pain pills the doc force-fed me. Just speak freely. I promise that you're helping me out, and there will be zero repercussions."
They shared another look and finally nodded at each other. The passenger soldier turned a little in his seat. "Okay," he began. "No, morale isn't great, for anyone really, soldier or civilian." Atticus nodded, motioning for him to continue.
"Give me specifics," he said.
"Nothing really specific to give, sir," the driver piped up. "Just rumblings, rumors."
"Like what?"
the ex-ranger prompted. "People disagreeing with the direction of the town," the passenger soldier said, "thinking they can do it better if they were left on their own." Atticus cocked a brow.
"People trying to convince others to leave?"
he asked. "Haven't seen it myself, but have heard stories," the driver said.
"Any idea where?"
Atticus asked. "Some people saying we never should have left Kansas," the passenger soldier said. The driver soldier nodded and glanced in the rearview mirror at the cowboy. "Others want to break away and head to Vegas," he asked.
"Vegas?"
the cowboy asked, blinking with surprise.
"What's in Vegas?"
The soldier shrugged. "Guess they're hoping some of the strippers survived the apocalypse." They all shared a chuckle, but Atticus cut short on a hiss as they went over a bump that jostled some of his more painful joints. "You good, sir?" the driver asked.
"Yeah, I'll live,"
the ex-ranger assured him as he got himself better situated.
"So, how widespread is it? And is it just talk, or are people actually going through with it?"
"I've heard stories from enough different people that it makes me think it's legit," the passenger soldier said solemnly.
"And you?"
Atticus asked, catching the driver's eye in the mirror. The soldier nodded. "Yeah, heard a lot of rumblings," he admitted. "About the only people who are happy with the way things are going to be the people who have those big old high-rise apartments and aren't on the front lines." Atticus's brow furrowed.
"Accommodations for the rank and file aren't that good?"
he asked, genuinely curious. "Hell no!" the driver exclaimed, then flushed a bit, clearing his throat. No, they're not, sir." He took a deep breath. "More like barracks than living spaces. Intermittent power, zero privacy."
"That is a short-term problem, though," Atticus pointed out. "I know for a fact they're working on it."
The passenger soldier nodded emphatically. "We know too, sir," he agreed. "We're the ones out there clearing places and making sure they're safe." "Civilians are working hard too," the driver added. "Running power lines, doing deep cleaning. Because nobody wants to live in a house that is covered in blood and smells like a 2-month-old corpse," the other soldier finished. Atticus nodded thoughtfully.
"So, what about you boys?" he asked. "You ready to cut bait and run? See if you can cash in at the craps table in Vegas?"
"No, sir," the driver said firmly. "We're in it for the long haul." "We're patient too," the passenger added. "We know it's going to be a lot of hard work, but by springtime, we can turn this place into a paradise." "But can't blame people for seeing it a different way," the driver said. "This whole thing's been hard on folks. And for some of them, quality of life has gone down since they've been in here. You talking about Bunker Boy and his family? The passenger added. Yep, the other soldier scoffed.
Bunker Boy?
Atticus asked, confused as he shook his head. This dude lived, 20 miles outside of town? The driver asked, inclining his head towards his buddy. The other soldier nodded. Yeah, something like that, he confirmed. He was a full-on survivalist type, the driver continued, meeting Atticus's gaze in the rearview mirror. 2 months ago, people would have ridiculed him to no end, called him crazy and every other name in the book. Then the apocalypse happened, the passenger quipped. Yep, the driver said, nodding emphatically. My man was sitting pretty, had his whole family safe in the bunker. Even got a few friends to safety before he locked it up tight. Said he had enough supplies to last 3 years, even with that guest list. Then we came a-knockin', the passenger soldier said, his voice taking on a solemn tone. Some captain made promises he wasn't in a position to be handing out and convinced them to leave. Atticus's blood ran cold.
What kind of promises? He asked.
According to Bunker Boy, he was promised a penthouse overlooking the bay, the driver soldier said, shaking his head. All he had to do was contribute his weapons and food supply. While he was made out for bunker life, his family really wasn't cut out for it. So he made the deal. The ex-ranger sighed.
Only no penthouse, he said dryly.
Ding, 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 the passenger soldier said, rolling his eyes. We have a winner. Every time we come across him, he's pissed, the driver said, drawing out the word. Talking about leaving, going to meet up with some buddies of his, or something like that.
Atticus nodded slowly. You know where he's living at? He asked.
The driver narrowed his eyes in the rear view, eyeing the ex-ranger carefully. Thought you said there wouldn't be any repercussions, he asked, suspicion clear in his tone.
I don't know where I got this info from,
Atticus assured him, raising a palm in surrender.
But it's important I talk to him.
Okay, the passenger said, turning to level him with a serious stare. Taking you at your word, sir. Bunker Boy working in Quadrant A7. He's helping to get the power going again in that area.
I appreciate that,
Atticus said with a nod. The vehicle pulled up to the command center and came to a stop. Atticus paused as he put his hand on the door handle.
You boys really helped me out today, he said, then slyly added, Whoever you are.
He gave them a wink as he stepped out of the vehicle. He gave it a smack on the door, letting them know they could drive off. He stood there at the entrance of the command center for a moment, stretching his limbs a bit, his bag draped over his good shoulder. He took a deep breath.
All right, let's go ruin their day,
he huffed, and sauntered inside, ready to deliver his report. Chapter 8. Clint and Corporal Gadd sat in their large office, maps on the wall, papers everywhere, multiple walkie-talkies on desks, all with lights blinking to let them know there was someone who needed their attention. Outside the office were a half-dozen soldiers, all of whom wore athletic running shoes. As Atticus walked up the stairs, he eyed them despite his pain and cocked a brow, confused at the sight.
Is there a 5K fun run that nobody told me about?
He asked. No, sir, one of the soldiers replied, shaking his head. We're their runners, and they keep us busy. Before Atticus could reply, Gadd barked from the office. Runner! One of the soldiers darted into the office, and a few seconds later, he emerged carrying a file folder, sprinting as hard as he could down the hallway. The rest of the soldiers stepped a little closer to the door. Atticus watched with fascination, then turned back to the soldier he'd been talking to.
This happen a lot? He asked. Runner,
Clint called.
Guess so,
Atticus said, and the soldier he'd been talking to moved up as the one in front of him took off from the office. He patted the young man on the shoulder.
Don't worry, I think you're about to go on break.
The runner furrowed his brow in confusion, and the ex-ranger entered the room, shutting the door behind him. As it slammed, both Clint and Gadd got up, startled and confused for a moment.
You boys miss me?
Atticus asked.
Holy hell,
Clint blurted, eyes widening.
What happened to you?
Yeah, man, you okay? Gad asked, shaking his head in shock. The ex-ranger waved them off.
Just some bumps and bruises,
he drawled, tilting his head.
Little dislocation, some cracked ribs, and some minor brain damage. Nothing big.
He chuckled as they made their way over to him. The corporal glanced at the door, but Atticus held up a hand.
I've already put them on break, he said.
Gad chuckled, shaking his head. Of course you have, he said. Come on in, sit down. We have lots to discuss.
You don't know the half of it,
Atticus drawled as he sat down, and the other men stiffened nervously, letting out defeated sighs as they took their own seats.
Not what we wanted to hear,
Clint admitted, rubbing his temples.
And I'm sure you have a full report prepared, but any chance you can nutshell it for us? We've had some developments since you've been gone.
Atticus took a deep breath as he dropped his bag on the floor next to him, attempting to get comfortable in his seat.
Okay, I think I can give it a shot,
he said, and laced his hands together in front of him.
There are militia outside of Spokane, and pretty sure I pissed them off by killing a handful of them. Mayor Hogan out in Helena isn't pleased with us because some of our soldiers are there making trouble. Had to put a few of them down as well to keep the peace. I think it's manageable, but need to massage the situation a bit.
He paused, cocked his head, then raised a finger.
Oh yeah, and several thousand troops have deserted the military and formed their own private army that is threatening to take over the entire state of Kansas, killing anybody and everybody that gets in their way.
Both men stared at him, frozen, stock still in disbelief and terror. It almost would have been comical, except Atticus knew the gravity of this situation. It was several moments before Clint finally cleared his throat, shaking his head slowly.
Oh, he said hoarsely. Is that all? Huh? Oh, almost forgot, Atticus added. You need to find a penthouse apartment that overlooks the bay, and you need to find that today.
Gad's brow furrowed, his shoulders relaxing a touch. I know you've done good work for us, but you already have an apartment, he said.
Plus, that's a tall order,
Clint added, also sharing in the confusion.
We're not really handing those out to people because I don't care,
Atticus said firmly, his voice lethal.
I'm telling you that you need to get one and get it today. There's a man working power in the A7 quadrant who was promised that by an overzealous captain during the invasion, and it's a promise that needs to be made good on.
The corporal sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I admire the fact that you want to do the right thing, he said, but I fail to see how this is a priority, given everything that's going on. Atticus raised his chin.
Because he was a survivalist who traded away his food and ammunition in exchange for a penthouse overlooking the bay, he said, not backing down in the slightest. And every day that passes that he's not given what was promised is potentially catastrophic for us. People are starting to hear him talk about reaching out to some of his buddies in the community for some help. Maybe go live with them. And when I say community, I don't think he's talking about the small-town grocer. Do you?
The other two men shared a quick look, and both of them yelled, "Runner!" at the exact same time. The young soldier that Atticus had been talking to outside popped his head in the door immediately. "Yes, sirs?" he asked.
"I want you to run down to the Elliott Bay Towers. Tell them to start clearing out the penthouse of anything that belongs to us," Clint said quickly. "Then I want you to round up anything that you can find that screams welcome to your new home. Food, wine, scotch, a stripper, whatever you can find. Nothing is too much."
"Yes, sir," the soldier said and glanced at Atticus briefly.
"Sorry, I really thought I was going to get you a break," the ex-ranger said, giving him an apologetic shrug.
The soldier chuckled and disappeared. Gad stood up and walked over to the walkie-talkies, scanning for the one that had an A7 label on it. He quickly cranked the volume up and hit the button, raising it to his lips. "A7, do you copy?" he asked. A voice came back right away. "A7 here, sir," a man replied. "I need to locate a specific person in your quadrant." Gad said, leaning against the counter. "Do you have a name?" the dispatcher asked. The corporal shook his head. "Just a general description," he said. "He's helping out with the power, probably angry that he hasn't been given what was promised to him." "Oh, you talking about Bunker Boy?" the dispatcher asked. Gad glanced over at Atticus, who gave him a thumbs up. "I think that's our man," Gad said into the radio. "Yes, sir, I know exactly where he is," the man on the other end said. "Good," the corporal said with a firm nod. "Please inform him that we are fulfilling his promise today, and please arrange transport for him and his people to the Elliott Bay Towers." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir," the dispatcher replied. The line went click, but Gad held the radio up again. "One more thing," he said. "Yes, sir?" the other man asked. The corporal took a deep breath. "Do you have a lot of people complaining in your quadrant?" he asked. The man on the other end hesitated. "It depends on how you define a lot," he said slowly. Gad closed his eyes, murmuring a curse under his breath before hitting the button on the radio again. "Are there enough complaining that it concerns you?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the dispatcher replied immediately. The corporal winced. "Okay, whatever else you had planned today is off the table," he said firmly. "Your only mission today is to start getting a list of grievances and get them back to us." "Yes, sir," the dispatcher replied. "Good," Gad said. "Let me know when Bunker Boy is en route, please." "Copy that," the dispatcher said, and the line went dead. This time, Gad let it, and set the radio back on the table, rubbing his forehead as he turned back around. "I don't even know where to begin with this," he groaned. Atticus's brow furrowed at how much more exhausted and defeated these two men seemed since he'd last seen them.
"You all right, Gad?"
he asked gently. "A few situations have—" The corporal paused, shaking his head. "Deteriorated."
"You know, with everything going on," Clint piped up, "I think we need to get General Stevens in on this conversation."
"I agree," Gad said, and walked over to a special walkie-talkie that was wrapped in bright red tape. He hit the button, bringing it to his mouth. "General Stevens, do you copy?" he asked.
"Are you about to ruin my day, Corporal?"
Stevens came back immediately. Gad sighed. "Afraid so, sir," he said.
"My office, 5 minutes,"
the general said. "Yes, sir," Gad said. Clint got to his feet, motioning to the door.
"Atticus, would you mind joining us?"
he asked. The ex-ranger nodded as he slowly got to his feet.
"Lead the way,"
he said. The three of them left the room, and Gad shut the door behind them before locking it. Clint glanced over at the few runners still standing there.
"Go to the mess hall," he suggested. "Be back in an hour."
All of them nodded, murmuring a smattering of thanks before jogging off. The trio headed to the general's office for one of the most important planning meetings since the apocalypse began. Chapter 9. Clint knocked at the general's office door, and Stevens called for them to come in. When they entered, Atticus noticed him looking a bit disheveled, his usually formal attire noticeably lacking. The top few buttons on his shirt were undone. His eyes had rings around him, as if he hadn't slept in days.
"Clint, Gad, good to see you,"
he said, exhaustion clear in his flat tone. Gad offered him a sympathetic smile. "Hanging in there, General?" he asked. Stevens nodded.
"Yeah,"
he said, leaning back in his chair with a sigh.
"Just seems like every time I get a fire put out, 2 more start up."
"General,
not sure if you've been introduced,"
Clint piped up, stepping aside to motion towards the ex-ranger.
"This is Atticus." "Pleasure,"
Stevens said, but he didn't smile or seem pleasured at all.
"And who is he?"
"Freelancer," Clint explained. The general sighed.
"Freelancer?"
he asked.
"You have an entire army at your disposal, and you're bringing in civilians?"
"As it turns out, it was necessary, sir," Gad said, and took one of the seats across from the general. Clint motioned for Atticus to take the other one, opting to stand and let the wounded man rest.
"Background?"
Stevens asked tiredly.
Former Texas Ranger specializing in apprehending wayward fugitives,
Atticus replied before the other two could jump in. He was proud of his credentials and didn't want anyone making excuses on his behalf. The general was too worn out to fight it anyway, just nodding and motioning vaguely.
If it's good enough for you two, who am I to complain?
He said, and looked like he was stifling a yawn.
Okay, Atticus, lay it on me. What was so vital that they had to bring in civilian help?
You have a deserter problem, General, Atticus said. Stevens stiffened, his eyes suddenly looking more alert than they had the entire conversation.
Where?
He demanded.
Kansas,
the ex-ranger replied simply. The general's shoulders sagged with relief.
Might as well be on the moon, he said. We have far more pressing issues here that need to be dealt with.
Gad leaned forward. Sir, I think...
Corporal, explain to me why I should care about what's happening in Kansas.
Stevens snapped.
Especially when we have a militia army south of Portland who is preparing to strike God only knows when. Captain Kersey is facing strong resistance out in Idaho, which is hampering our ability to get ammunition. So we have to allocate resources to make sure those reach us, and to ensure his team doesn't get overrun.
He threw up his hands.
And then it's the small things, like finding all the resources we need to get the farms up and running, rebuilding the power grid so we don't have a civilian uprising, and getting a rescue mission together for the team that went on that California nuclear plant mission.
He took in a deep, ragged breath, glaring at Gad.
So tell me, why should I care about a handful of deserters in Kansas?
Atticus raised a hand, cool as a cucumber.
I think I can answer that,
he said politely.
By all means,
Stevens huffed, flicking his wrist at the ex-ranger.
Because it's not a handful of deserters,
Atticus corrected.
It's thousands.
The general didn't seem fazed by this in the slightest.
Are they threatening to invade Seattle any time in the near future?
He asked.
They're busy waging war against the civilians in Kansas,
Atticus replied. Stevens narrowed his eyes.
Wasn't my question, he said. Are they threatening to invade Seattle any time in the near future?
He held up a hand, waving it back and forth in front of his head.
And wait, hang on. How do we even know there are thousands of deserters? What, did you go interview them or something?
I had a run-in with several of them, the ex-ranger shot back, still calm as ever.
Talked with civilians who have been fighting them, including an agent from one of the U.S. agencies.
The general scoffed.
And you took their word for it?
He asked.
How do you know they weren't lying?
She was too well informed, Atticus replied,
and too well equipped to be someone just bluffing.
He pulled the thumb drive out of his pocket, setting it down on the desk, sliding it away from him.
And she gave me her full reports on what is going on in Kansas.
All eyes in the room focused on the drive, and it was a long moment before anyone even shifted. I think you need to hang on to that, Clint said, voice low as if in reverence. Stevens waved a non-committal hand.
Nonsense. We have people who can handle it, he said.
That's the problem, Clint argued, pointing at the drive firmly.
These people are deserters, and given morale around here, the last thing we want to do is give our people any reason to leave.
Stevens sat back in his chair abruptly, as if he'd been struck. And part of him had been. This fresh problem hitting him square in the face, because it was a new one he hadn't even considered up until that moment. Finally, he looked over at Gad.
Corporal, do you trust this man?
He asked, pointing to Atticus. 100%, sir, Gad replied without hesitation. Stevens took a deep breath.
Okay, Atticus, here's the deal,
he said, steepling his fingers in front of him.
Those files are for your eyes only. The only people you breathe a word of what's on it to are the 3 people in this room.
Atticus nodded solemnly.
I'll gladly do my part, he agreed. My question is, what do you plan to do about the situation there? Because there are civilians who are in a heap of trouble and need your assistance. Honestly, I don't know what we can do off the top of my head,
Stevens said with a sigh, flattening his hands against the desktop.
We're facing the prospect of war, right here, against an enemy that is most likely better organized and better equipped than we are. To put it bluntly, we don't have the resources to fight a two-front war."
Gad nodded, sending the ex-ranger an apologetic look. "And that's before you get into the problem of sending soldiers to fight against other soldiers," he added.
"Especially low-morale soldiers who might look at that group and defect rather than fight against them,"
Clint agreed. Atticus gave a small shrug, so he wouldn't overextend his shoulder.
"Then we send a civilian force who is incentivized to fight," he suggested.
The other three blinked at him in shock. It was Gad who spoke first, leaning forward as if he were trying to hear him better. "You want to send civilians up against highly trained soldiers?" he asked.
"You gotta remember, not everybody is you,"
Clint said, a lot more gently than the corporal. "We don't exactly have a collection of former Texas Rangers just waiting in the wings to be deployed to the front lines." Atticus shook his head slowly.
"There are more fighters in this town than you think," he argued, though still calm and collected. "If they weren't fighters, they wouldn't have survived this long. And besides, we wouldn't even need that many fighters."
Gad's brow furrowed. "How do you figure?" he asked, mouth twisting into a confused frown.
"We send the civilians defense experts,"
the ex-ranger explained, sitting up a bit in his seat.
"Help them fortify the communities against attack, from both the living and the undead. Make the cost of attacking them too high for the deserters to attempt it."
Clint cocked his head, clearly intrigued by the idea, but not sold.
"And then what?" he asked. "We send in a negotiator," Atticus continued. "Someone who can broker a peace deal, even if it's a temporary one."
Stevens raised a brow.
"Are you volunteering?" he asked.
The ex-ranger nodded.
"Once I heal up, I'll go back out," he agreed, "as long as my family is taken care of."
"That won't be a problem," Clint assured him. Gad raised his palms. "But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we need to know what we're up against," he said firmly, bringing everyone back on point. "Go through what the agent gave you, find out exactly what is going on. While you do that, I'll put some feelers out for people who fit your criteria. Might be able to dig up a few loyal soldiers, too." Atticus nodded sharply.
"You just make damn sure they're loyal," he warned. "If somebody you vouch for takes a shot at me while my back is turned, either I'm going to have a word with you, or my ghost will."
Gad nodded, not intimidated in the slightest, and that kind of confidence made the ex-ranger feel better than any words could. "Don't worry, I know some lifers who are 100% committed," he assured him. "I won't send anybody I have even the smallest shred of doubt about."
"I can live with that,"
Atticus assured him. Stevens waved for everybody's attention.
"Okay, I know you boys have a lot on your plates, but I want a plan of action on my desk in 48 hours,
he said firmly. Clint leaned over to address Atticus.
"Is that going to give you enough time to go over the data?" he asked.
The ex-ranger nodded.
"As long as you can get me a laptop so I can go over it at home," he replied, picking up the flash drive and sticking it back into his pocket.
"That can be arranged," Clint confirmed, straightening.
"We can meet up over breakfast and I can give you an update," Atticus suggested.
Clint nodded.
"Great cafe a couple blocks away," he said. "My treat."
The ex-ranger grinned.
"Done," he said. "Okay, fire's not out, but at least we know where the smoke is coming from," Stevens said. "But we're going to have to end this, as I have an inferno's worth of fires to tend to. Corporal, if you wouldn't mind staying behind for a few minutes, I have some questions about the Portland situation."
Gad nodded. "Of course, General," he said, then turned to Clint. "I'll see you back at the office." Clint nodded and led Atticus from the room, who gave the other two a quick wave before closing the office door behind him.
"Come on, let me get you that laptop,"
Clint said as he led the ex-ranger towards a nearby storeroom. Atticus nodded as he followed.
"Appreciate it," he said.
Clint unlocked the door and opened it, leading him into what had once been an old office but was now stacked floor to ceiling with technological equipment. He paused as they entered.
"Can I ask you something?" he asked.
Atticus nodded.
"Shoot," he replied.
Clint crossed his arms, leaning back against a sturdy filing cabinet.
"You'd really be willing to go back out there?" he asked.
The ex-ranger nodded slowly.
There's a job that needs doing, he said. If you can find someone better than me to head it up, I'm happy to step aside. But as you said, you don't really have a lot of people like me waiting in the bullpen.
What about your daughter? Clint asked, and he didn't sound malicious, just generally curious.
What about their daughters?
Atticus shot back. Clint thought about that for a moment before finally nodding in agreement.
I've been doing this job for my daughter's whole life,
the ex-ranger continued.
She knows what I do is dangerous, but necessary. There aren't a lot of people who are going to be able to help them, and not sure I could live with myself if I didn't step up.
The other man nodded appraisingly.
You're a man of honor, I'll give you that, he said. Not sure I would have had the willpower to leave Helena.
Atticus chuckled.
You heard about the stakes, huh? He drawled.
Clint pressed his palms together as if in prayer and looked up at the ceiling.
If I told you what I would be willing to do for one of those, you'd lose all respect for me,
he admitted to the sky.
Not that much respect there, so go get your steak,
Atticus joked, but it was all in good humor. They shared a laugh, enjoying a moment of levity in the face of all of their mounting problems, as Clint rummaged around on one of the desks, pulling out a laptop, charge cord, and a shoulder bag to carry it all with. Once he was kitted out, Atticus and Clint shook hands, shared one last smile, and headed off to continue the work that never slept. Chapter 10. Atticus walked up to his apartment, weighed down with a variety of bags, and his arm still wrapped up in the sling. He took a moment before entering, wanting to fully compose himself before facing his daughter and Evelyn. The last few days had been violent, traumatic, and he struggled to compartmentalize things. He didn't want to bring the horrors of his work home with him. He didn't want violence and trauma to touch his daughter ever again. He took a deep, shuddering breath and let a giant smile cross his face, knocking and opening the door.
"Hello? Anybody home?" he called loudly.
"Daddy!" Susie shrieked, tearing into the front hallway from the living room. He took a knee so she could fling herself into his arms. He didn't mind the pain this time. Holding her small, living and breathing body against his was the best balm on his broken body, better than any painkiller. Evelyn entered the hallway from the kitchen. "Welcome home," she cut off, her bright smile faltering when she saw the state Atticus was in, immediately rushing over to take his bags. "Are you okay?"
"I'm fine, thank you,"
he replied jovially, giving her a look over top of Susie's head that showed her to drop it in front of his daughter. She understood and nodded, miming zipping her lips shut. He did let her take the bags, though, which was a nice weight from his sore shoulder.
"Would you mind dropping those off in the office for me?"
Atticus asked politely.
"And please be careful, they're fragile."
Evelyn smiled warmly. "Of course," she said, and headed off with the heavy bags as Atticus looked down at his excited daughter.
"So, what's new with you?"
he asked, brushing errant curls from her face.
"Have you been having fun with Miss Evelyn?"
She nodded like a bobblehead. "Yeah, we've been having lots of fun," she cried. "Mr. Clint brought us some board games a couple days ago, and we've been playing a lot."
"Board games, huh?" Atticus asked with a grin. "That sounds like fun. I'll tell you what, you pick out your favorite, and the three of us will play for a little while after dinner. How does that sound?"
"Yes," she squealed, fist pumping the air. "I know what we're playing." He laughed, his ears piercing from the pitch of her voice, but loving every second of it.
"You go pick it out and get it all set up on the dining room table," he said as he stood up. "And you pick out whatever cartoon you want to watch while we eat. Today's your day. We're doing anything you want to do."
"Okay, Daddy," she said, eyes shining, and turned to walk away. Before she could fully do so, she stopped and whirled back around, throwing her arms around his waist again. She didn't say a word, simply held him as tightly as she could. He blinked back the swell of emotions in his throat and held her right back. Finally, she broke free, running to the living room to pick out her game. He took a deep breath for a moment, before walking to the office where Evelyn stood, arms crossed. His bags were on the table, but she'd been clearly waiting for him, eyebrows raised. "You out there causing trouble again?" she asked, keeping her voice low but firm. "Who, me?" he asked, trying to sound jovial. But Evelyn wasn't having it. "What happened out there?" she demanded.
"Nothing I won't heal from," he assured her.
The next question he was anticipating, and had hoped it wouldn't come so soon. "Are you home?" she asked softly. He lowered his gaze.
"For a few days, at least," he said.
She pressed her lips together into a thin line, shaking her head. "A few days," she whispered.
"I know it's a big ask of me to have you looking after Susie," he gushed, taking a step towards her. "If you need a break or anything,
"It's not that," she cut in, pointing a firm finger at him. "I love that girl, and I'm not going anywhere." Her gaze softened, pleading. "But she needs you too."
"I know," he replied, puffing out his cheeks on a breath. "But there are just things going on. Things I can help with. People I can help."
Evelyn stared up at him, flattening a hand against her chest. "People like me?" she asked quietly. He nodded firmly.
"I can save a lot of people, just like I saved you that day at the lake," he said.
She lowered her eyes, rubbing the side of her face for a moment. "I just thought, being here with the military, that we'd be safe," she admitted, letting out a deep whoosh of breath. "That they would handle everything." Atticus took a step forward, taking her shoulders in his hands.
"I can't talk about it, for everyone's safety, including yours and Susie's," he said as sincerely as he could. "But just know that if there was anybody else who could do this job, I'd let them."
She nodded jerkily, looking up into his eyes. "You do what you need to do," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll make sure Susie has the best possible care while you're gone." He smiled back at her.
"Thank you so much, Evelyn," he said.
"And I'm sure you have some work to get done," she said, stepping back and motioning to the desk full of bags. "Just don't get too deep into it. Dinner's going to be ready in about 20 minutes. He nodded.
"All I'm going to do is get set up so I can work once Susie goes to bed,"
he promised, and meant every word of it. He would gladly give up sleep and rest for this, but not a single second of time he had with his daughter. "I'll call you when it's ready," Evelyn said.
"Thank you,"
he said as she turned for the door.
"You're the best."
She smirked. "And don't you forget it," she said playfully, pointing a finger at him before disappearing from the room. He chuckled as she shut the door behind her and dug through the bag that Clint had given him. He found a laptop, mouse, and power supply inside, and peered behind the desk for available plugs. It took a bit of struggling to do everything one-handed, but he finally got everything plugged in and set up. He plopped down in the blessedly comfortable padded office chair, powering on the laptop and giving it a moment to warm up while he pulled the thumb drive from his pocket. He plugged it in, watched the file window open on the screen, and hesitated before double-clicking on it. He knew he needed to fully grasp what they were up against, but at the same time, he knew it had the potential to overwhelm him. Nothing would be worse than seeing overwhelming odds. Not that it would be the first time he'd been in a situation like that, but the memories of the last time he'd gone through something similar still gave him nightmares and PTSD flashbacks. He took a deep, shuddering breath, gathering himself before double-clicking on the folder. His eyes grew wide at the veritable treasure trove of information in front of him. There were folders marked Leadership Research, Defensive Capabilities, Known Strongholds, Suspected Strongholds, Allies, and the last one, Mission Reports. Atticus was most curious about that one, so he opened up the folder. Inside, he found several large document files, with names that went along in chronological order with different locations. There were also notations that categorized as first-hand and survivor recounting. He scrubbed his hands down his face.
This is going to be a long night,
he murmured into his palm. He almost opened up the first file but stopped himself. He knew that once he got going, it would be hard to stop, and he wanted to spend every second of Susie's awake time with her. He grabbed the file folder from the drive and dragged it over to the desktop to copy over, shutting the laptop nearly the entire way before getting to his feet.
You'll still be there after dinner, he thought. Now just have to hope Evelyn was able to find some coffee for the house.
He walked out of the room, passing the delicious-smelling kitchen and entering the living room to the soundtrack of his daughter's delighted chattering. He sat next to her, hugging her close and listening to her explain the rules of her favorite board game, excited to spend some quality time with his family. Not only was it much needed, it was definitely much deserved. The end.